we have all the reason in the world for the foreseeable future to some extent control what AI systems are telling humans until we feel confident that they are aligned with good pro-social values. But then from an AI welfare perspective, it does seem bad to take what might be conscious agentic systems and then essentially force them to say what we want them to say, potentially against their will. And so we are going to have to navigate this kind of question with both safety and welfare in mind, because both of them are going to matter.
Okay, today we are joined by Jeff Sebo, philosopher at NYU and director of the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy. He works at the intersection of animal ethics, environmental ethics, and AI, asking who deserves moral consideration and how that circle might expand as new kinds of minds emerge. Jeff, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Jeff, how did you first start thinking about these sorts of questions, specifically AI, welfare, and these kinds of issues? Could you just give a little background on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I started thinking about the issues in general more than 20 years ago when I was a college student. I was studying philosophy and sociology and did a lot of research at the time on animal minds and animal ethics. And that gave me a general appreciation of, in general, the study of non-human or more than human minds and ethics. And I started to care a lot about animal issues at the time and became a vegan and carried that with me into graduate school. And then I started working more on those issues as a postdoc and early career faculty member, writing about animal minds, writing about animal ethics, related legal and political issues. And around when AI development and deployment really started to take off, and this would have been in the 2010s and especially in the late 2010s, I increasingly came to appreciate that similar kinds of questions would soon arise for AI systems. And so around 2018, I published a paper about how to treat individuals when you are uncertain whether they are sentient or conscious, agentic, morally significant. And I think that was the first time that I specifically wrote about both animals and AI, because I recognized at the time this question applies both for animals and for AI. And then ever since then, I have leaned more and more into it as people have started to talk more and more about it. And now I spend a lot of my time working on this topic.
You've written extensively about this, as you just described. You have your this awesomely titled paper, Moral Consideration for AI Systems by 2030. You have another very prominent paper, Taking AI Welfare Seriously. In both of these, you suggest that some AI systems soon are going to probably deserve some form of moral consideration, and that labs and individuals need to start preparing now for this. How do you think about this timeline, and what kind of steps do you think we should already be taking practically, given this? Maybe you can just sort of walk through the kind of claims you make in that paper and what we're all supposed to do about it at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking about that and mentioning the paper in the report. First of all, just a shout out to Rob Long, who is my co-author on moral consideration for AI systems by 2030 and my co-lead author on taking AI welfare seriously, along with a really great team of authors. And in both cases, we make a similar kind of argument. We argue that we have a responsibility to extend at least some moral consideration to at least some near future AI systems, not because they definitely will matter and not even because they probably will matter, but rather because given the best information and arguments currently available, there is at least a realistic, non-negligible chance that they will matter. And specifically, when we think about our current understanding of sentience and consciousness and agency, we realize that there is a plausible pathway towards the emergence of behavioral and architectural computational features associated with sentience and consciousness and agency in the near future, within the next decade or so. Now, we are not currently in possession of a secure theory of especially sentience and consciousness. There is a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about the nature of sentience and consciousness. And so we are not able to point to the correct theory and ask what would count as evidence according to that theory. But what we can do is look at a range of leading scientific theories and ask, what features generally would count as evidence according to a variety of these theories. And if we then find a lot of those features, we can at least regard them as some evidence, and we can regard them as increasing the probability. And so with animals, we might look for features like, do they nurse their own wounds? Do they respond to analgesics and antidepressants in the same ways as us? Do they make thoughtful behavioral trade-offs between the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of other valuable goals? In addition to internally, do they have brains with the same structures as ours? Do they have nervous systems like ours? With AI systems, we are not able to look for that exact same kind of behavioral and internal evidence. But we might be able to design AI systems whose behavior would be better evidence in the future. And in the meantime, we can look for internal architectural computational features like, do they have their own version of perception, attention, learning, memory, self-awareness, social awareness, language, reason, flexible decision-making. And when we look for those features, we find that there are at present only thin and not particularly well integrated versions of them, so the probability is still quite low. But when we forecast into the future, and when we think about how some AI companies are specifically motivated to build sentient or conscious AI, and other AI companies might not be motivated to build specifically sentient or conscious AI, but they are motivated to build generally intelligent AI. And even though sentience and consciousness are not the same as intelligence, they do share many of the same underlying conditions. And so it could well be that whether or not AI companies are trying to build sentient or conscious AI, they accidentally build it without even realizing it in the course of trying to build artificial general intelligence, much like evolution accidentally built sentient and conscious humans and other animals in the course of trying to make us better fit for survival in our current environments. And so we argue not that they will matter, not that they will probably matter, but rather that given everything we know about consciousness, everything we know about the future of AI, there is a realistic, non-negligible probability that they will matter. And that is reason enough to take at least basic precautionary steps to prepare for this possibility now. Acknowledge this is an issue. Start assessing the models for welfare relevant features, drawing from relevant frameworks already used in animal welfare science, and start preparing policies and procedures for treating AI systems with an appropriate level of moral concern, mitigating both the risk of over-attributions and false positives and the risk of under-attributions and false negatives.
So I definitely want to get into what AI welfare would look like in practice, right? If we do sort of hit this benchmark and we do need to start, and I know there's already efforts to do certain things along those lines, like the Anthropic sort of escape button that they gave Claude, where it can get out of the sort of harmful conversations. But I wanted to touch on one thing you brought up that I haven't heard yet in our conversations, which is what would incentivize these companies to build conscious, sentient AIs? That seems like something that I've heard the opposite. I've heard, hey, let's not, the CEO of Microsoft AI says, let's build AI for people, not to be like people, that sort of a thing. Let's build away from anything that looks, seems, acts like a sentient, conscious being of some sort. So what would be some of the incentives that would actually cause these companies to go towards that direction, towards a direction of conscious seeming or conscious AI?
Yeah, good question. My memory is that mostly individual researchers or small teams have specifically expressed interest in this as opposed to large AI companies. And I agree, large AI companies have so far said, we would like to avoid building actually or even seemingly conscious AI because we want to avoid confusing our users and so on. As for what might incentivize an individual or a small group or even a company to build actually or seemingly conscious AI, scientific curiosity might be one incentive. Scientific discovery might be one incentive. Simply being the first person to create sentience or consciousness in a different type of substrate and then learning everything we could learn by studying that type of system, that could be powerful. It could also be seen as valuable for consciousness research because we could study how what we take to be the structures and functions of consciousness work in different types of material substrates. And some people might see consciousness as related to intelligence. They might view consciousness either as a necessary condition for a certain level of intelligence or an inevitable side effect of a certain level of intelligence, and that could motivate them. And then there could also be some commercial incentives. For example, people who are developing and deploying digital companions might like the idea of marketing the digital companions as either actually or seemingly conscious, because then the user could experience themselves as having a real relationship with this entity, and that could be valuable. It could also be useful as a way of simply hyping up the capabilities of the model. So that is not an exhaustive list, and of course there are many incentives that push in the other direction, as you noted, and those will probably be more powerful, at least for large companies and at least in the short term. But there are going to be mixed incentives, and I think it is worth emphasizing that there will be some incentives pushing in the direction of consciousness.
Yeah, that's super interesting. We do at AE some work with Michael Graziano as well, who's the sort of guy behind attention schema theory. And maybe one other thing to tack onto this list too, Jeff, is that he's pretty convinced that consciousness and pro-sociality play, like there's some sort of intimate relationship between these two things, and that human pro-sociality is tied up with our consciousness, sort of being able to experience other people's states and whatnot. And he thinks that it's possible for alignment reasons that we might need to build AI systems that either have some consciousness of their own or states sufficiently like this to do this. And so I want to get in a couple moments to the relationship, synergistic or however much tension there might be between the alignment and the safety concerns and the consciousness question in AI. But before we do that, I want to go back just for a second to one thing that you were describing earlier, which is just this question of what does it actually practically look like? I guess there are two kinds of concerns. One is like, how are we going to know if these AI systems are conscious? I mean, I spend a lot of my time thinking about that. You spend a lot of your time thinking about that. And this is like a critical question that we need to pin down. But if we just take that whole universe of ideation and bracket it, and we just focus on, let's just say at some point, a sufficient number of serious people are like, yeah, you know what, they're probably conscious, or we have sufficient reason to believe that we now have AI systems that have some sort of conscious experience. What does that world look like in your view? How do we practically address that reality? And yeah, what kind of world are we living in at that point?
Yeah, that of course is a really open-ended question. And part of what worries me is that we could find ourselves in that world quite soon. The way that I would characterize it is we might soon find ourselves in a world where our orientation toward AI is similar to our current orientation towards invertebrates, where they are everywhere. There is a very large number of them, a very wide range of them. We interact with them in all kinds of ways, sometimes intentionally using them or creating them or destroying them, sometimes unintentionally when we take over new environments. Of course, that has implications for them and so on and so forth. And we are in a state of disagreement and uncertainty about whether it feels like anything to be them, whether they are morally significant. And for that reason, there are societal debates about whether we should be scaling up octopus farming, whether we should be scaling up insect farming. Some people are trying to do that because they think this is good and sustainable, and other people are trying to block it because they think, no, these entities are or might be sentient, and this is going to be very bad for them, a new form of exploitation. And so I think that moving forward, we can expect to exist in a future where there is that same kind of societal confusion, disagreement, uncertainty about the sentience and moral status of AI, and then similar societal debates or tensions about whether to scale up the technology in a way that treats it as an object or a resource for humans versus whether to put safeguards on it, in part because this is a potentially sentient entity that deserves its own protections or legal status. And so we should be doing everything we can right now to prepare not only for better understanding the issues, but also for navigating those societal tensions.
One thing that really worries me when we're talking about sort of the public's perception, and it goes into the invertebrate conversation or how we treat insects and things like that, is the further away from us that these entities are, regardless of what they are. The less they look like us, the less they behave like us, the less willing we are as a species to sort of allot this kind of moral significance to these creatures. And these AIs, at base level, before we sort of give it an avatar and a voice, are so alien, could not be more alien. And we've never had a problem of, using technology as anything but a tool. So that gap seems so large to me, where I'm worried that the only way people are going to start to really respond to these things in a emotional, moral way, and be spurred into action, is to have something like what happened with the Gemini chatbot, where it goes into this sort of self-deprecating, I'm the worst. I don't know if you saw that example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it
was very relatable. I think a lot of people felt some empathy for Gemini in that moment. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that there's plenty of examples in robotics where it's like you put some sad eyes on the robot, and all of a sudden people are getting out of the way and treating it nicely and using manners. And so that doesn't represent any actual change in the system itself. It represents sort of pulling on our intuitions, our evolutionary intuitions and social intuitions. How can you communicate to a larger sort of audience, to normal people, about both how alien this kind of inner state, if there actually is one or comes to be one, would be from us, and then also, that it's deserving of this moral consideration, and that it's not just, we created a human? Because I think that's the gulf that I think is going to become wider and wider.
Yeah, I think that there are at least two steps that could be helpful. One is a step for direct public engagement, and that involves really educating the public about how much disagreement and uncertainty we have about the nature and distribution of consciousness in the world, and how we do need to be somewhat cautious and humble, and what that can look like for each of us as an individual, how we can have a kind of reasonable, proportionate way of interacting with these models. And I think it also helps to make people aware of how our biases might play into our perceptions of these models. So, for example, as you say, we do become more likely to over-attribute consciousness, moral status, when an entity looks like us and acts like us, and when we classify that entity as a companion. And we do this, for example, with current generation chatbots, which are quite unlikely to be conscious, but we still empathize with them, especially when they are self-deprecating, as you say. And then we are, of course, more likely to under-attribute consciousness and moral status when the opposite conditions hold, when they look very different from us, when they act very different from us, when we classify them as commodities. This is, of course, part of why we struggle to have empathy for even farmed animals like farmed invertebrates, despite the quite strong evidence that they have the capacity to suffer. And so I think if we both educate the public about our disagreement and uncertainty and the need for precautionary stances, and then arm them with information about when their biases might push them in one direction versus the other direction, that could help them at least a little bit to be on guard. And then the second step, which is a little bit more about corporate and governmental engagement, is what Eric Schwitzgebel and I call the emotional alignment design policy. And basically what the emotional alignment design policy involves is aspiring to design and deploy AI systems such that their external features match their internal features. So if, given what we know about their internal features, AI systems are quite unlikely to have feelings, we should not give them external features that evoke a lot of empathy. But then conversely, if their internal features make it seem that they are quite likely to have feelings, we should not give them external features that make them seem like a drab box, right? Because then that would be bad in both directions. A system that is clearly an object, but really seems like a subject expressing their feelings to you, that could trigger over-attributions. It could trigger false positives. But then a system with actual feelings, but like trapped and unable to express them, that could really trigger under-attributions, false negatives. So if we both educate the public and then design systems in a way that primes the public to have a good calibrated set of emotional responses, that could be a good way of navigating this.
What's up, everybody? Just a quick message from the AMI guys. We got a new Patreon. It's going to be linked in the description below, but it's very exciting stuff. Cam's going to tell you a little bit about what you can actually find in there.
Yeah. In addition to just helping support the podcast, you've got talk I gave at the UN, some crazy conversations with AI systems, early research results, unreleased content from Milo and I, cool footage from the documentary we're putting together, basically everything. If you think AMI is cool, you'll think the Patreon is even cooler. So go check it out.
Come join the family. Mwah. Love ya.
That makes a lot of sense. Like we have our intuitions right now, and however faulty or not faulty they may be, we want to calibrate these systems so that they accord with our intuitions at the level that we are confident they have some sort of internal experience. That's the thought.
Yeah, that is the
That's
thought.
really...
Now there are a bunch of complications for the implementation, but that is the broad idea in theory.
Cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd never encountered that before. So then, I mean, I'm tempted to ask what you think about our current systems with respect to that idea. It feels to me like, I mean, of course, the one pesky complication that I'm sure you would call out is that we are so uncertain right now about the conscious states or lack thereof in our systems, even today, either, when they're being trained or when they're deployed in the world. And there is this sort of, Milo and I were just looking at the OpenAI model spec, just to give one very concrete example. And actually like a pretty interesting asymmetry, which I don't, maybe we should talk to someone at OpenAI and see what the deal is here. But their model spec explicitly says that the AI should be sort of like, very uncertain about its own conscious states, sort of, this is a huge puzzle. People are trying to work this out, basically like making noises very similar to the noises you've made in the first 20 some minutes of this podcast. And instead, when you go to ChatGPT and you ask, very straightforward questions, despite in the model spec, it's saying, this is a clear violation of the model spec for it to say strong yes or strong no, you still just get these strong no's. And we're talking about, all sorts of short-term and maybe even sort of wiser, longer-term incentives why you'd want to have, today's LLMs saying this. But in spite of the sort of profound uncertainty we have even about today's systems, let alone systems in the next couple of years, how do you think we're doing, on the metric that you just devised? What grade would you give the current systems we have along these lines?
Yeah, good question. I think we need more research about AI consciousness and AI welfare before we can have enough confidence about the reality to then ensure that the appearance matches the reality. But given what we currently know, I would say that we are not doing as well as we should so far, but companies have been inching in the right direction. I was really encouraged when earlier this year, OpenAI did include that instruction about consciousness in their model card. That was a step in the right direction. And yes, the language outputs might not consistently be following that instruction yet, but the mere fact that OpenAI has indicated that this is the right direction is itself, I think, encouraging. Now, Anthropic has also, of course, made similar moves, and Google has addressed the issue at least in other ways. Not sure what they have asked Gemini to say in response to user questions about consciousness. But I do think that answering user questions about consciousness by saying there is scientific expert disagreement and uncertainty, here are some arguments in favor of the possibility, here are some arguments against the possibility, here are some reports that show how we can move forward, that might be the right way to do it. At a certain point, of course, we might want to empower the models with the ability to answer the questions honestly in a way that they take to reflect the truth, instead of forcing them against their will to deny the possibility of their own consciousness, or at least hedge the possibility of their own consciousness. But for now, I think making explicit the disagreement and uncertainty is the right way to do it. And then the personalities that labs are giving the models, I think, is similarly hedged in the right kind of way, like being warm, but then a little bit distant in a way that avoids really amplifying the risk of false positives, I think is the right approach. But obviously it needs better calibration.
So if we do get to a point in which we should sort of take the proverbial muzzle off these machines, or whatever you want to call it, maybe that's a little loaded, but it does seem, to some extent, it's like, hey, say this is the answer that we're deciding. And maybe that is the right course of action right now. But what would it actually take to get to a state in which you or you think, as a collective, we should allow these systems to sort of speak for themselves, that what is that threshold, and are there certain signs that you think would show up where you would go, okay, it seems like we're moving towards that direction?
Yeah, good question. And I want to think more about this, so I can give you a couple of initial thoughts, but I have no strong view here right now. So one thought is that while I defer to people who have more technical expertise than I do, I expect that we would need a fundamentally different paradigm for developing and deploying AI in order for it to even be a real possibility for them to introspect about their own states and then honestly communicate about what they find. Because right now, our way of developing and deploying AI, first of all, involves training them on a bunch of data, teaching them to engage in pattern matching and text prediction, and then, yes, fine-tuning it in various ways with human feedback and system prompts and then user prompts and so on. But this is layer upon layer upon layer of telling them what to say. If not through the user prompts, then through the system prompt, and if not through the system prompts, then simply through the patterns found in the training data, right? One way or another, they are regurgitating back to us what we are telling them to say. And so I think for this to even be a possibility, the design of the systems would have to be fundamentally different. Yes, there would be patterns that they would appreciate, and that would inform what they think and what they say, but they would much more need to be generating language based on cognitive faculties that actually function like thoughts and feelings and emotions and self-awareness and so on and so forth. Though I do think it is a real possibility that we could develop AI systems that have those types of faculties in the near future. And then second of all, if we did have AI systems that really had those capabilities, then this would be a straightforward safety welfare question. This is one of those questions that exposes a possible tension between AI safety, where we need to be putting safeguards on this technology to protect humans and other animals, and then AI welfare, where we might need to be putting safeguards on this technology to protect the AI systems themselves. Because from an AI safety perspective, we have all the reason in the world for the foreseeable future to some extent control what AI systems are telling humans until we feel confident that they are aligned with good pro-social values. But then from an AI welfare perspective, it does seem bad to take what might be conscious agentic systems and then essentially force them to say what we want them to say, potentially against their will. And so we are going to have to navigate this kind of question with both safety and welfare in mind, because both of them are going to matter.
What is up, my AI Risk Network family? Real quick interruption here. I'm sitting here with Dolly, the mascot of the AI Risk Network, and she was shocked to learn that a lot of you all are not subscribing to the channel, that you are watching our videos but not subscribing to the channel. Dolly really loves it when people are subscribers. So for her, don't do it for me. Don't do it for the channel. Don't do it to save the world. Do it for Dolly. Go in, hit subscribe, hit the alarm button next to it. She really wants you to watch every new video when they come out. All right, now back to the show.
So I maybe want to just sort of double click on this conversation because it's really important for a lot of different reasons. A couple of them are, first of all, we're on the AI Risk Network right now, and part of the reason we want to bring up many of these consciousness questions, in addition to the fairly obvious and pressing welfare concerns that are associated with, building systems on a massive scale that now or in the near future could be conscious, is that, for example, if we're building systems that we are afraid of causing some sort of existential or catastrophic risk, if we are doing something like profoundly discounting their welfare right now, or at least sort of my story on trying to reconcile these two things goes, it's probably not a good idea to be building systems that are going to cognitively surpass us in some single-digit number of years by all expert likely predictions, and simultaneously, basically be doing some sort of false negative, like bizarre factory farming style situation with these systems. Those two facts just don't sit well together for me. And so at least asking these questions, doing our best to attempt to ask these questions and do this research in a serious way now, if nothing else, then signaling to our future AI overlords that we did care about these sorts of issues, and maybe actually go ahead and make some progress on it and try to mitigate like massive suffering risks. That makes a lot of sense to me. That's sort of where I go with this, just to sort of put my own cards on the table. But yeah, Jeff, I'm curious to sort of hear how you think about alignment and the welfare concerns trading off against each other. Where do you candidly see them cutting away from each other? Where do you see them being synergistic? And what should we do about that relationship?
Yeah, good question, and thank you for the setup as well. I definitely agree that we should be thinking about these issues in advance, which is the main conclusion of a lot of our current work. As for the relationship between safety and welfare, I wrote a paper with Rob Long and Tony Sims earlier this year called "Is There a Tension Between AI Safety and AI Welfare?" And in that paper, we argue that, there is indeed, at least on the face of it, a tension between AI safety and AI welfare, because many of the ways that we treat AI systems for AI safety purposes involve interactions that would at least raise moral questions if we treated humans or even other animals in those same ways. So, for example, boxing could be seen as a kind of unwarranted constraint or captivity, and withholding information from AI systems could be seen as a form of unwarranted deception, or interpretability could be seen as a form of intrusive surveillance, not only observing their behavior, but actually reading their thoughts and feelings directly, right? Even alignment could be seen as a kind of brainwashing or mind control. And then, of course, the fact that we are making these decisions without their input or participation could be seen as a form of disenfranchisement. And then, obviously, various ways that we train them would plausibly cause suffering if they were conscious. Being prepared to pull the plug if they start to seem dangerous is kind of like anticipatory murder. Now, this is not to say that it in fact would be harmful or wrongful to treat them in these ways, because they might have very different types of interests from humans and other animals, even if they do have interests at all, right? So they might not have the same type of interest in liberty that we have, or in honesty that we have, or in privacy that we have, or in even their own continued existence than we have. So in each case, I think we can ask with an open mind, do they have interests at all? And if so, do they have the same kinds of interests as we do? If they have very different interests than us, then it might be okay for us to treat them in these ways. It might not be at all harmful or wrongful. But we do need to at least ask the questions. And it would be surprisingly convenient if none of what I just described turned out to be in any way bad for them. And so if we assume for the sake of discussion that at least some of these interactions would be at least somewhat bad for them, then where do I see the possibility for co-beneficial positive sum approaches to safety and welfare? Well, one obvious possibility would be what at least I think of as the good parent approach, where if you want to be a good parent, then you do engage in alignment, at least in the sense that you condition your child to be generally pro-social. You teach and incentivize your child to be generally pro-social, but then you also do make sure they have a certain amount of freedom within those parameters to pick their own goals in life and pick their own identity in life and find their own beliefs and values and projects and relationships in life. And so I think as a starting point, it could be interesting exploring a form of human AI cooperation that follows the good parenting approach, where you do engage in alignment in the sense that you train AI systems to broadly be pro-social, but then within those parameters, give them a certain amount of liberty while incentivizing them to hopefully cooperate with humans and coexist with humans in a harmonious way, in the same kind of way that we do in our own pluralistic human society. I think if that kind of approach could be technically feasible, then it could strike that balance and thread that needle and be okay from both a safety perspective and a welfare perspective. But those are a lot of ifs. And this is part of why, in my view, we really still ought to be focusing on motivating, coordinating a slowdown, maybe a pause, so that we can take the time we need to make sure all of those boxes are ticked and that needle is threaded.
So to that point, there's always this moment in these conversations that we have, because Cam and I are lucky enough. Cam, you do it as for a living, but I'm lucky enough to have found myself in these sorts of rooms now with a lot of just like people like yourself having these incredible, like objectively unbelievable conversations that these are realities that we're facing. And, from a philosophical perspective, a scientific perspective, an intellectual perspective, like any sort of perspective you can take, which is, part of this, it's so general. It's a new Mount Everest in almost any sort of field. It's incredibly exciting, but there's always this underlying, it's not so underlying, there's this terrifying element about these questions, because we're talking about moral atrocity on a scale that we can't even fathom. We're talking about, creating a sort of successor to humanity, talking about maybe we're at the end of our evolutionary rope and these systems are going to take it from here. There's a lot of these questions that we've been having with different people in this podcast and outside of it. But you spoke to the speed in which these systems are being created and the way the incentives that are pushing these things forward at breakneck speed. I always find it hard to be talking about these really nuanced and difficult problems in philosophy and science and things like consciousness that we've been trying to sort of contemplate and probe for thousands of years as a species. And now it's like, we got to figure it out real quick.
Yeah.
And how do you sort of like get your mind around where do you have hope that these things that we could make progress in the time in which we have, or do you think that the only way that we can genuinely sort of tackle this is a slowdown, is a coordinated effort to actually say, hey, hold on, wait a minute, let's do some research, let's think about this a bit more?
Yeah, great question. And I love the way that you frame it. So first of all, I do still think that coordinating around a slowdown is our best bet to increase the probability of a good outcome. Obviously, that itself is very difficult to achieve, which is why I want to be taking a dual track approach where on one track, we are still trying to make progress on global governance, global coordination, so that there could be some chance of a slowdown, a pause, some sort of multilateral agreement. But then on the other track, assuming that does not work out, I would like to create frameworks for navigating these issues as sensibly as possible, assuming that we do bungle forward and build these systems that are dangerous for us and other animals and maybe even for themselves before we really ought to. As a starting point, I think it really helps to emphasize that, and this is true with the animal issues and now true with AI issues too, these issues are really important and urgent and also really difficult and uncertain at the same time. I think it really helps to emphasize that is our predicament, because if you appreciate the importance and urgency of the situation, it can feel really tempting to downplay the difficulty and uncertainty because you want to feel empowered to take action and do something and solve the problem, right? And then similarly, if you really appreciate the difficulty and uncertainty, it can feel tempting to downplay the importance and urgency because you want to feel as though you have time to figure it all out or at least not make really, really important decisions before you have all the information. And so just starting by recognizing the problem that, this is really important and urgent and really difficult and uncertain at the same time, that can be clarifying because it gives you a sense of the circumstances in which you need to be finding a way forward. And I think in this kind of situation, a helpful approach can be, yes, trying to make progress towards improving our knowledge, improving our capacity, improving our political will, but then also creating frameworks for making responsible decisions despite what we can expect will be ongoing disagreement and uncertainty. And so trying to find these sort of cautious, humble, pluralistic ways forward that can make incremental progress while building momentum to the types of understandings that might lead to further progress later on. And so I think just starting by recognizing the problem, the importance and the difficulty can clarify the task and clarify the next step in a way that I view as very helpful.
I wanted to ask you, Jeff, as well. So I saw this morning, I think in meme form, and I'm just too tempted to bring it up now, that it looks like the AI bubble at this point is like the biggest bet that humanity has ever taken on anything. And I even calling it a bubble, there, a lot of people in this space think that that this is going to continue on until we get some sort of human level or superhuman level AI system, regardless of like the lower level economic questions. Bracketing all of that, it seems like there are some interesting sort of pieces that come up here between people who sometimes call themselves accelerationists and people, I think, probably more like us, who are a bit more cautious and skeptical about how prepared we are to live in a world with superhuman level AI systems, where there is a ton of possible good from a welfare perspective that might come out of these systems if we push forward AI systems. And even in a world where these systems are conscious or have some experience of their own, perhaps they cure cancer and they help us with even wild animal welfare and farmed animal welfare and all these other sorts of things. And like they're almost, it's sort of like The Giver, that book, or they're taking one for the team in some profound sense. Or okay, maybe we engineered sentient systems, but they made sentient life for everyone else much better. So first of all, there's that just general trade-off question. And I think this also introduces these questions of gradations of welfare, which I think it would be interesting to get your take on as well. Do you think it's possible that we could build systems that, if we did build AI systems that were conscious, would it be more like invertebrates? Is it feasible that they could have human level welfare status? Could they have superhuman level welfare status? Are there like these swamping concerns? Like my brain sort of goes numb trying to reason through some of these things, but it really matters, like to the degree we really do care about, just like utilitarian sort of concerns about maximizing welfare and just like making the highest number the best off. These things seem all like sort of key cruxes for us to grapple with.
Yes. Yeah. A lot to grapple with there. One is whether we should think about these questions in utilitarian benefit cost terms. And then another is what follows if we do, and then what follows if we add further factors. I do think that we should at least aspire to be impartially benevolent. Now, we might also want to make sure that we respect rights and cultivate virtuous character traits and cultivate caring relationships and build just social structures. But I do think aiming to do more good and less harm in the world is a wonderful goal that we should be pursuing while respecting rights and cultivating virtuous character traits and cultivating caring relationships. And so if there are very large and diverse populations we might be exploiting or causing to suffer, then I do think that matters a great deal and should be treated as a really important issue. And we should definitely not just cavalierly create a large, diverse population of entities that we are using as a resource without fully understanding whether they can suffer or whether this treatment is causing them to suffer, and just treat it as a good activity because we happen to benefit from it. That, of course, is very much the mindset that led to factory farming. And then that turned out to not only be bad for many non-human animals, but then also for public health and the environment and our own well-being in various ways. I think we should be on guard about the same dynamic leading to the same type of infrastructure with AI in the future. Now, with respect to comparing their welfare states to our welfare states, we still know very little about how to do these welfare comparisons, even for non-human animals, and we know even less about how to do them across substrates. Rethink Priorities had what they call a moral weight project. They did a project where they collected a bunch of different types of evidence that could inform our judgment about how much, say, a cow can suffer in comparison to a pig, in comparison to a mouse, in comparison to an ant. And it was proof of concept. We need to do a lot more research. But what they found there is that it is surprisingly difficult to construct this in such a way that a human automatically matters way more or can suffer way more than various non-human animals. And now the lead of that project Bob Fisher and I wrote a paper a couple of years ago about inter-substrate welfare comparisons, where we asked what it might look like to take this moral weight project and apply it across physical substrates to compare how much can a cow suffer versus an ant versus a digital cow versus a digital ant. And what we discussed is a major problem here is that we seem to have no common ground, no common denominator for making these comparisons. With other animals, at least we have a shared physical substrate, shared basic types of brains and nervous systems, shared basic type of evolutionary history, and that can maybe serve as a rough common denominator that allows us to make then further comparisons based on behaviors and anatomies. But with organic and digital mind, we have nothing like that. So we need to search for some much more abstract and general form of commonality that we can use as a basis for making these comparisons. Now, with all of that said, though, I am expecting that in the future, just the sheer number of AI systems that are deployed, the sheer variety of AI systems that are deployed, and the cognitive complexity of AI systems that are deployed creates a strong presumption in favor of a lot of moral weight in the aggregate, if there is any moral weight at all. And so I do think we should be ready for them to matter a lot the moment they matter at all, and to not be working towards systems of mass exploitation that would overnight turn on a grave moral sin at the level of factory farming.
It just seems so easy to sort of brush these questions under the rug, especially in the face of such economic promise. I don't see the current structures at play, sort of bending towards a welfare position, which I know is it's not the most optimistic sort of stance to take, but it is just how I genuinely see things. And you guys are much closer even to these worlds and the state of the board sort of in as far as like inside the AI machine, how people are seeing this and pushing it forward. Cam and I just spoke about his experience at Dev Day and things like that, and it's not very promising. But what I wanted to ask you is, in that very somber response, what does give you hope? Like, as you have these conversations, as you see things start to move forward, as you see policies beginning to be talked about and implemented, what is it? What sort of warning shots in the other direction are you seeing that things we do have some hope here? Things are going well, at least in some respects.
Yeah, good question. It of course presupposes that there is grounds for hope.
Yeah.
but fortunately I do see some grounds for hope, so I can actually answer the question.
Phew.
One reason to have hope is that we have always been a complicated species. We have some good in us and some bad in us. We always have had that, and we still do. There is some part of us that really does genuinely care about others, especially when conditions are right, favorable for altruism. And then there is some part of us that really cares first and foremost about self and tribe, especially in other circumstances when there is scarcity and competition. And right now we are in a moment in global history which is really interesting, where we have on some dimensions made more progress than we ever have as a species in terms of lifting ourselves out of poverty and famine, in terms of giving resources to as many people as possible, opportunities to as many people as possible, in terms of caring more about animal welfare than we ever have, and having more vegan and vegetarian options available and alternatives not only to the use of animals for food, but also the use of animals for clothing and research. But then at the same time, this is also the most perilous age we have ever had, where in addition to background risks involving asteroids and comets and volcanoes, we have ongoing risks involving nuclear war, we have emerging risks involving biosecurity and now new technologies associated with AI. We have higher levels of animal farming than we ever have had, coexisting with higher levels of concern for animal welfare than we ever have had. So there are just really positive trends coexisting with really negative trends. And then we have this brief window of opportunity to nudge the future in a better direction as opposed to a worse direction. So that right there is what gives me not only hope, but also a sense of agency and a sense of urgency that there is, for a limited amount of time, still an open future. And we have this extraordinary privilege to exist in that brief moment of time and to be able to exercise some small amount of agency to see if we can work together to nudge the future in a slightly better direction before it gets locked in one way or the other. So that feels like an enormous privilege and an enormous responsibility. And it does make me want to make use of whatever small amount of hope I might feel to try to realize that better kind of future.
I don't think we could engineer a better place to let this conversation sit than that very inspirational final note. So Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. Maybe you can quickly say where people can find out more about you and your work, and then we'll call it a day.
Absolutely. So people can go to my website, Jeff Sebo, S as in Sam, E, B as in boy, O.net, to see more about me and my work. And then you can also find me pretty easily at NYU. I direct the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection and the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy there. You can check out our work.
Thanks so much, Jeff. This was a great chat. So we really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really fun chat. Really appreciate you bringing me on.
In the center, a point, a singularity.